worries, no worries. I mean, we're increasingly being harassed by technology, so it's part of normality. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm also delighted to speak on what is actually secretly a number of topics that I sort of in a way weave together, starting from the start, at least from my perspective, but then getting also indeed to what you could, I think, could say today is the, let's call it the predicament of democracy. That is, we need to defend in a way democracy. What can we really do about what is going on? But let me start from the start, if I can manage to.
Yeah, those are the arrows. Let me check if
Technologies.
yeah, we are.
Where are
did.
you?
So the arrows.
Oh, that didn't work before. I don't know why. No worries. So yeah, as I said, I'm delighted to be here. I'm really thankful to the organizers for allowing me to speak in such a prestigious context. And I'm basically going to revisit a number of lines of work that I've been doing for quite a while now in relation to indeed deliberation, deliberative democracy, more recently what is a kind of trend, maybe even hype around so-called citizens' assemblies, but also tying it to what I think is important to at least to keep the organizers happy, to link it in some ways to law, in particular to constitutional law, because of course the what I sort of call the hype around citizens' assembly most of the times is not necessarily directly touching on dimensions of law or constitutionalism, but I think the most interesting part of it is around those dimensions. So I've structured my talk, I guess I have something like 30-40 minutes, right? So let's see if I can manage to cram everything I want to say in such a short time, but let's see what happens. And so I've structured the argument today around 4 different elements. First of all, is more generally about deliberation, about what you could call the participatory turn in democracy, but also in terms of constitutional reform, which is one thing I'm particularly interested in. Yeah. Okay. And so I start a bit with an introduction on these dimensions with regard to constitutional law, but also more generally with regard to liberal democracy. Then indeed I will say a couple of more specific things about what I think has happened in roughly the last 10-15 years in terms of forms of citizen participation in constitution making. And then I will link it to an experience that I've been following quite from nearby, that is the so-called Conference on the Future of Europe, which is maybe not necessarily something that directly relates to constitutionalism, but I've been always seeing it in this light. That is, I've always been looking at the Conference of Europe on the Future of Europe as a kind of second moment after the Convention on the Future of Europe 20 years earlier, touching upon potentially constituent dimensions of the European integration project. And when we've briefly talked about that, I want to get to a 4th point that I think is extremely important and can't be left out. And that is indeed, to what extent are deliberative assemblies, and more widely speaking, deliberative democracy, and maybe even more widely speaking, participatory democracy, to what extent is it part of the solution, or rather potentially part of the problem? To put it in other terms, and I always promise to myself that I shouldn't be so alarmist, but my particular view nowadays is that we are facing a really dramatic time in terms of democratic systems, forms of participation, protection of human rights, etc. So I think we cannot really talk about democratic participation, democratic innovation, without also immediately ask the question, do these things in one way or the other help to keep democracy alive? Or maybe even better, to reinvent democracy so that it starts working better, so that it manages to keep less or anti-democratic forces, to keep them more at the margins where they aren't really currently, I would say. Oh, now it works. I just need to click. Okay. Okay, so let's start from the start. I mean, it's for decades, and of course, since the 1980s, that various scholars have been talking about participatory democracy, forms of citizen participation in different ways. And so you could say there's a kind of participatory revolution going on. At the time, it was always understood, I think, as a kind of adjustment of the current system, as a liberal democratic system that needs innovation to thrive better in a way. I've always been interested in how this then, at a certain stage, started also relating to dimensions of fundamental basics, the rules of the democracy. So as I put it here on the slide, participation in relation to the constitutional framework of democratic societies. And so one of the cases that somebody made me aware of some 50 years ago was Iceland, which I always found fascinating, the idea of reinventing the Icelandic constitution by means of a kind of bottom-up, some even call it crowdsourced project. I still remember that at the time I was working at the University of Trento, and anyone knowing the University of Trento knows that on the one side of the road you have sociology department, I was working there, and then the other side you have the, and still today I suppose, the law department. I remember discussing the Icelandic experiment with a very famous law professor. And as you can imagine, this law professor was super dismissive of any idea of having citizens deliberate or talk about anything like constitutional reform. And so that only strengthened me in my idea that this was actually really something interesting. And I'll come back to it later, but I think personally, I've always thought this, that if we need to think about deliberative democracy and participatory democracy, then it's exactly the constitutional dimension where it becomes important, where it would be really important to have some kind of citizen participation in the formulation and reformulation of constitutional values, deeper principles, human rights, etc., as the basis of, let's use the term that I ultimately didn't use in my title, but let's say to reinvent the democratic social contract, if we want to call it like that. And so this is then a debate that I wanted a bit to start off with, that is an interest in what participatory and deliberative democracy can mean in processes of constitutional reform. And I have to admit, it seems to me that that debate, it's still there, but it has become a little bit less central, probably also because of this final part of what I want to talk about in this talk, that is the fact that democracy seems to be crumbling in front of our eyes. So it's a little bit more difficult to think about something that many would still see as a kind of luxury, to be able to deliberate and take the time of citizens to deliberate about the ground rules of democracy. But I still think this ought to be an important discussion. Maybe the most recent case where you saw some of this, though not necessarily explicitly in deliberative citizens' assemblies, was the Chilean constitution-making, on-making process, if you want to call it like this. But this is also an example that shows that indeed it seems to be by now almost impossible to think about serious constitutional change without some form of citizen engagement. And that also brings me then to what you could see indeed the larger two forms in which participation has materialized in cases of constitutional reform. The most well-known one, which also, for instance, in the Italian constitution, is a potentiality, that is citizens' confirmation of constitutional change through, indeed, affirmative referenda. And you see that in many different democracies, that this has become a way of accompanying constitutional reform. The second one, citizen participation in deliberative fora and assemblies, is maybe a little bit less evident. Also, because I suppose there are not that many cases, and there's only maybe one case where you could really say that made a huge difference. That is the Irish case. But in that case, you might say, I'll come back to that in a second, it wasn't necessarily a full-blown constitutional reform process, but it was rather a number of specific points that became part, first of a deliberative process and then of a referendum process, which now, as we all know, has become, as a success story, a bit more complicated since the double referendum of March last year, where the opposite sort of position seemed to be taken by the Irish public. That is, less progressive in a way, or at least that's one way in which you could read it. But so, indeed then, in constitutional politics, there are not many, but there are by now quite some examples where different types of participatory instruments have been used. Maybe what you see here, the Icelandic case, would be the full-blown example, where they used first two kind of ad hoc, bottom-up organized assemblies with around 1,000 Icelandic citizens, and then later there was a process of a constitutional council redrafting, and then in reality it became the idea of drafting a new constitution, also using digital instruments. At the time, mostly, I think, Facebook and other means that they had in the early 2010s. And so this has become, in a way, a core point, a focal point in thinking about how could constitutions be changed through citizens' participation. And the only reason maybe I show this table is that, as you can see, the deliberative part is probably the least used means of changing the constitutions. I guess by and large, even today, in most cases, constitutional reform is about largely elite-driven, institutionally driven processes. But indeed, this is changing, you might say, and it seems to me, at least, increasingly difficult nowadays to start a full-blown constitutional reform process where you completely bypass citizens. In that sense, we'll come back to that later, thinking about something like a European Convention, which would be not the classical constitutional reform, but treaty reform, which is in a way, I suppose you could say, a kind of equivalent on the European level. Hardly anyone talks about citizen participation, which is a bit surprising, I think, in some ways, but we come to that in a second. So let's link this argument a little bit more to, let's say, the nitty-gritty design dimensions of participatory processes, and also a little bit more to what you could call what is by now a kind of industry of organizing citizens' assemblies. And there are even, indeed, scholars their trademarked version, like Liberation Day is one very prominent example of this, where indeed there's an enormous amount of energy spent on how exactly do you need to design deliberative processes so as to make them most effective. I suppose that's the idea. But what I wanted to briefly pause on is that I think you can at least, for reasons of clarity, divide processes of deliberative participation in three, let's call them moments. That is, as Eisenstadt and others have called it, indeed, the convening or the initiating moment. They have all kinds of questions. Who initiates? How do they initiate? Whom is involved? Who makes the choices? There's the deliberation phase, where the actual discussions take place. And also there you have enormous variety of ways in which you could organize that. And then you have a third phase, which you could call in different ways. In the constitutional reform story, you would perhaps indeed talk about a ratification, like in Ireland. You have a referendum on abortion, and so the referendum in a way ratifies the recommendations made in the Constitutional Convention that took place in Ireland. But you could also think about it in a broader sense, thinking about other kinds of deliberative assemblies as well, where it then becomes about what is the follow-up? How does the citizen deliberation actually lead to tangible outcomes? And I guess that third phase is the most complex one, because in certain ways, the more there's a need for actual outcome of citizens' deliberative assemblies, the more you might say there is a kind of shift in power, because you empower these assemblies, they make choices, they make recommendations that then need to be institutionalized. And so it becomes a tangible, real voice in the political process. And that's also, I think, where I can just sort of throw around the figure. It doesn't make much sense, maybe, but let's say 80–90% of citizens' assemblies don't really work because they don't have an outcome. They don't have a tangible policy making or constitutional reform type of follow. And so the discussion nowadays, and I have to admit, I'm sort of trying to, in a kind of bipolarity that I have in my head, try to tie together two discussions. That is, on the one hand, the one I started out with, that is citizen participation in constitutional reform. That's one debate. Maybe the main label nowadays would be deliberative constitutionalism. But there's also another debate that is much more prominent, and that consists roughly of democratic theorists and political scientists that have become, I think you would honestly say, obsessed with citizens' assemblies, or in different guises. And I have to admit, I don't even always know the exact differences, what they call mini-publics. So there's a huge debate on deliberative democracy in this form. And of course, it links with the other discussion on constitutional reform, because I guess the core of the argument is it's about citizen participation. Deliberation is not necessarily, of course, about citizen participation. And so that's also, we come back to that with the Conference of the Future of Europe. The Conference of the Future of Europe is an example of this trend. It was a fairly original experiment where you actually do what is in itself already a very difficult thing to bring about. You create a deliberative assembly, but in this case, on the transnational level, with all the linguistic differences, with all the complexities that you get once you do it on a transnational, in this case, European level. Indeed, you could say, again, in a kind of very simplifying way, but distinguishing between different processes, most of the times what we see with citizens' assemblies is that they are ad hoc. So they're not institutionalized, they're not really part of solid democratic channels citizens can tap into, and so they pop up and they disappear. And you're not always sure what their effect is. I think this is the case on the Conference of the Future of Europe. Even, fair enough, the Commission has been doing its so-called European citizens panels in its wake. But these are particularly, I think, powerful in the way they are almost entirely invisible. Hardly anyone knows about them except for some of those part of the deliberative democratic bubble, which is a major problem, as I will say later. A different route would be where assemblies become part of the process. So maybe in Ireland that is roughly the case, although it could even be institutionalized more. The example that is often given in this more political scientific literature is Oost-Belgium, where it is part of the parliamentary process. So that's interesting. So you actually have, as part of the institutional legislative process, the existence of a citizens' council that then sets up citizens' assembly on a yearly basis, so to speak. But that's a very unusual example. And you could also think about this, by the way, I think, in terms of constitution making, right? Turn it into a proper deliberative vehicle of constitutional reform. And here a little bit of linking it indeed also to what I would call democratic imagination, where in this case I also put this label here. It's a civil society coalition of which I'm part, the Citizens Take Over Europe coalition, which is around 70 civil society organizations that work together on a European scale. Why are they relevant? Well, they promoted the idea of a European Citizens Assembly, institutionalized ones already some 5-6 years ago. And joining them, I was collaborating in critically monitoring the European the Conference on the Future of Europe. So as to understand what does this actually mean in practice, how much good does it do, etc. And what you see here is from a blueprint we produced where we just thought about, if you really want deliberative assemblies to play a role in the political process on the European level, what could that look like? So what you see here on the vertical level is, as you see it a bit over there, what I think is a major evaluative concept, so to speak, citizen empowerment. To what extent do these assemblies really empower citizens, really make a difference to citizens? And so all the third options are then the most radical ones, the ones that we probably will never see coming alive, because it would mean if you would have, for instance, an institutionalized mechanism. Let's say Article 11, Treaty on the European Union, also includes the right to hold the European Assembly initiative, which would be, let's say, you get a number of citizens from different European countries, and they say, we want to have an assembly on the European level on this topic. That would empower those citizens in a way, because they would be able to indeed invite a public debate on a specific issue. Let's say, I don't know, abortion. And then in the second step, in the deliberation phase, you could indeed have a citizens' assembly that actually interconnects with a wider European citizen, rather than being held in secretive European Commission buildings where nobody really knows about. And then in the third phase, if you want to give it some clout, some real political follow-up, you could say, okay, and then if they produce recommendations on abortion, this should be an obligatory European-wide referendum. So this is just a bit of thinking of some combination of some naughty civil society activists in a way with university professors like myself. I don't think this will ever see the light of day, but it's interesting to think about it, because it would be a kind of shift in terms of empowerment of citizens on the European landscape. But as you can see on the second level, you could also keep certain existing channels in the mix and say, okay, you don't do it through a new assembly initiative, but you keep the European Citizens Initiative, which is empowered to also call for a citizen assembly or so. The sky is the limit, you might say, in a way. But all of this discussion, and that is, I have to admit, and I'll come back to this, all of this discussion hasn't yet really come back to the fundamental questions that I think we should put ourselves. And I believe that too often in the trend around deliberative assemblies, citizens' assemblies, mini-publics, as we so often see in academics also, we start forgetting about the original questions. So it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Assemblies are fantastic, and so we need more of them. But nobody asks anymore, why did we want these assemblies in the first place? So I do think we always need to keep on asking ourselves, why do we want citizens' assemblies? Is it, for instance, because we think more citizen participation is intrinsically good? I guess most people would say, yeah, that's the way to go. Not everybody, by the way. And even you could question some of the models of deliberative assembly, whether they really lead to more participation or whether they're not actually having perverse effects. A second dimension which you often see in deliberative literature is also, it's not simply citizen participation because you keep them busy, so they don't go out and protest on the streets of LA or so, but you actually need citizens because they give you input that make your policy output better. I think this is, for instance, a very convincing argument if you talk about constitutional reform. Because if you want constitutions to, in a way, become part of a kind of constitutional awareness and a constitutional legitimacy promoted by citizens themselves, then making them part of the process of making choices about specific constitutional arrangements or not is an important part of the story. And that links then also to the third point, indeed, the legitimatory dimension. Citizen participation is not only interesting for having citizens part of the story. No, it ought to be creating a kind of embedment within society of norms and rules. Constitutional norms and rules. There is, I have to admit, the US story makes everything 10 times more complex. Because I'm luckily not a constitutional lawyer, maybe you have some of them in the room. It's the fault of constitutional lawyers and political scientists, I would say, that they have been always telling us that the American Constitution is so deeply ingrained in the American society that it will last forever. I don't think anyone would say this too loud at this particular moment. But it doesn't mean that this aspect is not important. I think it actually shows the whole problem. Apparently, most Americans don't give a beep about the American Constitution. And that's a serious problem. So in that sense, again, maybe assemblies in some ways could play a role. Think about when maybe Trump finally takes a step back, having a citizens convention in the US, rethinking the American Constitution, it wouldn't be an absurd idea from my perspective. And that brings me to the final point, which is the more radical one, which is the one that is least discussed. And that is, if you properly institutionalize, empower citizens' participation through deliberative assemblies, it ought to shift political power away from the current power holders. And that's also why we'll come back to that with the Conference on the Future of Europe, why members of European Parliament are not necessarily very interested in saying, okay, let's have an institutionalized citizens' assembly in Europe on a yearly basis where they can make real decisions. No, they don't want that because they're still struggling to get their right to initiative, etc. But of course, any democratic innovation that says we want to robustly endorse citizen participation would need to institutionalize that participation and give it clout, which de facto means redesigning power differentials out there in the institutional system. But I wonder if that fourth point is not actually the most important one. And it seems to me that the deliberative, how to put it, entrepreneurs are hardly ever touching that point. They know, of course, how touchy it is. But it seems to me ultimately that should be maybe the core argument. If we really want deliberative democratic citizen participation to be important channel within democratic systems. And so, well, I don't want to dwell too much on this because it would eat up too much time. But one thing I think we need more is some kind of theory of citizen empowerment. What does it really mean? To preempt any kind of critical discussion, I throw a big table at you. So before you were able to absorb that, we already shifted the next slide. There's a presentational technique, but what you basically see here, the idea is that I look here, if you see on the vertical line, you have these three moments again let's get it out of the... Thanks so much.
And the fix.
Thank you. Mr. Wolf, as they would call it in Pulp Fiction. And so what you see on the vertical line is basically temporal, right? So you have the initiation, let's say, of the conference on the future of Europe. You have the middle part where there's the actual deliberation going on. And then finally the follow-up. And in all those stages, I ask myself, how are citizens really empowered or not empowered? If, for instance, the European institutions, as happened with the Conference on the Future of Europe, set up a secretariat that designs, by and large, the whole process. That means that there's no real citizen participation in the design of the process. So that, I think, you would classify as not necessarily very empowering. And so you could do this exercise for all the different steps in the process and say, to what extent are individuals, mostly participants, empowered? To what extent are groups within the process empowered? And then thirdly, I think this is the most important question, to what extent is wider society empowered? Because you can have a nice, powerful citizens assembly with 200 people, but if the rest of society is not aware of it and is not empowered through that process, then the larger democratic, macro-democratic dimension is not really changing. You just get a sort of needle pointing in the legislative process where a little bit of empowerment is going on, but the larger democratic system is hardly aware of this. And so then it remains very limited. And then the more you go to the right, I try to a bit operationalize this, which is not easy, I have to say. Particularly if you know, I've been now observing quite a number of citizens' assembly from a close, and they're all a little bit different. They all work a little bit in a different way. So you always have to readjust a little bit your lenses to see what is really going on. And most of the times, what is really going on is behind closed doors, right? And that's where you need to be very aware of when you follow these processes, because real decisions, just like ordinary politics, are not made in the transparent parliamentary semi-hemisphere of open public debate. They're made elsewhere. And so that's always a really complicated matter. And so, well, bringing that back indeed to notions of constitution making, in cases of citizens' assemblies in relation to constitution making, you see indeed also there important organizational variety, and you have really interesting questions about who do you really want to put in the mix? Like, it can be citizens' assemblies organized institutions themselves. In a way, in Ireland, it was a little bit more modeled because it was promoted by civil society. It was promoted by specific political science professors, for instance, as well. It was promoted by political parties. And so that's an important part of the story. To what extent do we see more bottom-up and more top-down types of initiation of the process? And then the deliberative assemblies themselves also very, very much. Even in the Irish process, the first one included politicians. So it's 66 randomly selected citizens, but also 33 politicians. And in the second assembly they did, so in the latter half of the 2010s, they didn't do that anymore. And you can have arguments in favor or against. You could say actually having politicians present undermines an open sort of deliberative safe space for citizens. Fair. But you could also say, if you don't have politicians in there, they don't feel bound by the process. So they don't give anything. They don't care about it. And so they're not willing to follow up. And so then you create deliberative assemblies in a bubble that don't really enter into larger political discussions and debate. And so these are important questions to ask. And here again, a big table. We don't need to look at it too close, but here just to have a number of examples of national assemblies where democratic or constitution reform was part of the story. I could also have, by the way, put Italy here, with its, let's say, the Renzi reform process, because there was some kind of participatory dimension. But I have to admit, at the time, I had a comparative constitutional reform project called Co-Police at the University of Trento. And I was sitting literally on the Italian process, which was ongoing at that time, 2014, 2016. And I only found out at the very end of the project that there had also been something called Partecipa, where people could fill in a questionnaire, basically, that was there for us. It wasn't really deliberative, but it was part of a kind of attempt to say, hey, we're also doing citizen participation in constitutional reform. These are all very different processes, and I put the Conference on the Future of Europe also in there because I read it in a way as a process that also produced claims for treaty change. It actually produced one recommendation that said, we as the citizens favor the institutionalization of a permanent citizens' assembly. And I found it interesting because before coming here on the train, I was checking the website of the European Parliament to see what they say about follow-up to the Conference on the Future of Europe. And they have all the 9 topics that were discussed, and topic number 8 or so was democracy. And if you look on the democracy, that particular recommendation doesn't pop up for some strange reason. I need to investigate this, but it's probably a significant lapses by the parliament itself. Indeed, different processes where I like to side with the more critical scholars that say we need to keep flexibility into the mix. There's no one trademarked deliberative or deliberation day. It's perfect. There are actually all kinds of different ways in which you can organize deliberative assemblies that make sense in different contexts. And this is also important, I think, because otherwise we risk collapsing participation in full-blown technocratic thinking, as if the only thing that matters is the correct application of procedures. And I have to admit, when I interact with what I would like to call the cottage industry that has been popping up around this, and I won't name names, but there are various organizations that make good amount of money around this expertise, professional expertise in organizing citizens' assemblies. I'm afraid that there's a great risk that the whole thing turns into a kind of really technocratically predefined process, where it becomes harder and harder to see where the actual participation from bottom up is still possible, because the claim is it's a scientifically orchestrated process, and it can't be otherwise. And I side rather with Nicole Curato, for instance, who says citizens' assemblies are always ambivalent processes. They can be positive, but they can also have perverse effects, leading to, in a way, to the opposite of what they were setting out to do, leading to less participation from citizens rather than more. And in the worst of cases, I think, a huge problem is some, particularly democratic theorists, argue, and that's, I have on my last slide also an invitation to sign up to a YouTube channel we created in Citizens Take Over Europe, where we have one seminar with Nadia Urbinati and Christine Lafont, who criticize this idea of randomly selecting citizens. Because if you take this to the extreme, you create a kind of algorithmic democracy, where you say, okay, let's take a couple of demographic characteristics in our societies, throw them into an algorithm, the algorithm selects people, and those individuals stand in for, represent in a way, everybody that fits those demographic criteria. That means that all gray-haired, slightly bearded, glassed, university professor types walking around in Europe could stand in for me. And I just don't accept that. I think that's a huge violation of the principle of individual autonomy, which is at the heart of democracy, it seems to me. But if you read democratic theory on deliberation, some make this point very forcefully. They say you can't do this. And it's actually, it's more objective, it's neutral, whatever. I think it kills democracy, I have to admit. But often I clash with experts on deliberative democracy on this particular point. Wrapping perhaps a bit up the story about constitutional reform, etc. The main point I want to make here is indeed that I think one thing we need to keep into the mix if we talk about democratic innovation is democratic imagination. One of the core parts, I think, of experimenting this kind of stuff is that we continue thinking about what does it really do? How useful is it? How realistic is it? And that brings me also to the last question I will address later today. How am I doing on time? I've got no idea.
What about 10 minutes?
Okay, then I need to speed up a little bit. But indeed, the final point I wanted to make. Okay, I'll do my best. But the final point I think that is important, anyone talking about democracy in an academic and non-academic setting today is the thing we are promoting, is it indeed part of a solution or part of a problem? And if you are organizing citizens' assemblies that are largely citizen washing exercises that lead to institutions that can say, yeah, we actually involve citizens, but then the empowerment of those citizens is non-existent, wider society doesn't know anything about it, then you might be actually part of the problem, not part of the solution. And then you actually help maybe selling out democracy to the anti-democrats that are all over the place, as we I think, agree. And so I think that's a core question to ask. But let us briefly, in 3 minutes or so, address the Conference on the Future of Europe. Just one word, it seems to me that by now, this, what was at the time, celebrated example of European-wide democratic experimentation is by and large forgotten. Nobody really talks about it anymore. It's a bit like with the resolution of the European Parliament on having a convention and treaty reform, that's also by and large somewhere in some dusty, dark back room, it's still there, but it's not addressed anymore, in times in which I think you could make a shopping list of an enormous amount of necessities of treaty reform. Maybe just one example, defense union. And so treaty reform should be on the table, but it's not anymore discussed. And if it's discussed, it's hardly discussed in relation to the Conference on the Future of Europe, where there was not the majority, but there was at least some 10% or so of the recommendation that it had clear treaty reform implications. For instance, a call for a European-wide referendum. Well, if you want to do that seriously, you better put that in the Treaty on European Union, right? I will go a bit quicker here because otherwise the debate becomes a bit non-participatory, to put it mildly, more demagogic, which is the other stuff I work on. But so I think you could read the Conference on the Future of Europe as some kind of attempt to revive some form of constitutional moment, as in a way in the well, not really the slipstream, but in the wake at least of the original moment that was, you could say, the Convention on the Future of Europe 2003. But that original convention clearly did not have any pretension to include citizens. There was some civil society participation in 2002 to 2003. They managed, for instance, to put the ECI, European Citizens Initiative, into the draft constitution, which then later came back in the Lisbon Treaty, but there wasn't really citizen participation. So maybe the Conference on the Future of Europe could be read in a way as an attempt to link what you could call the convention method that emerged with the Charter of Fundamental Rights Convention, right? And later, indeed, the Constitutional Convention. And so an attempt with the Conference on the Future of Europe to finally link that convention method also with forms of citizen participation and deliberation. And that's, I think, a really interesting outcome, if you think about it. If it would become something that becomes part of a frame of mind, you could think of dedicated convention of the EU on a defense union, where you include citizens. I mean, shift military spending or shift existing spending away from, I don't know, the Erasmus program, serve money for civil society, towards arming European armies is a bloody fundamental question, I would say. So maybe you would want to ask citizens about it. I don't see many people making this claim, but although some of them are actually perhaps hinting at this. And so in that sense, indeed, the Conference of the Future of Europe could be read as an attempt to reawaken a bit the convention method, but actually include citizens into the mix, and then indeed deal with something you could call the constitutional deficit of the European Union. The EU treaty or treaties have never been part of citizen-driven discussion, right? And so another dimension I think would be interesting is one thing I really get sick and tired of is this invocation of EU values, as if this is the end all of everything. And I think EU values are important, but why don't we discuss them then with wider European society? What do we actually mean by EU values? If we talk about minority rights, does that include freezing the right to asylum for non-Europeans? If we talk about democracy, what do we actually mean by democracy? Is DDL Sicurezza in Italy part of that democratic model that we want or not? There are millions of questions you could ask citizens about, and maybe then you would indeed create more of a legitimation type of linkage between European citizens and the actual European integration, rather than this sort of communication ad nauseum, or need to uphold the European values, blah, 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 which particularly, if I may say so, European EU lawyers tend to put to the fore. Sorry for that. When we close the registration, you may hit me in the corridor. What? Maybe you can find some baseball bat somewhere. And so, well, maybe tying up a bit this argument about the Conference on the Future of Europe, I think indeed there is a constituent dimension. Others have said this too, like Alberto Alemanno and some others too. But maybe link it indeed to what I think is a more important discussion. So I'm sorry, I'm going a bit faster now. Getting to the, this we don't need either, to indeed some lessons that we could get from the Conference on the Future of Europe experience. One of them is, I think, what I just said about, in some ways, a reviving of the idea of a convention method, but with more serious types of citizen participation. And having said that, I think the plenary dimension in the Conference of the Future of Europe, which, if you followed it, you might remember, you first had citizens' assemblies with 800 citizens. That was purely citizen-based, and some experts, for instance, facilitators, but no politicians. And then you had the plenary moment where 80 citizens represented those citizens' panels and then discussed things with members of European Parliament, national parliamentarians, civil society people, etc. And I thought that is a really interesting, maybe, example of a kind of convention type of situation. So that's definitely an important, promising lesson. But there are also, I think, a lot of lessons that show huge problems of this exercise of experimenting with deliberative democracy in Europe. That is, you reduce, in a way, citizens to, atomistic, randomly selected people which have no link the one to each other. You throw them into a process of deliberation where most of the times, and I was one of the experts myself in the process, most of the time citizens had very little knowledge of what the EU, for instance, is doing in terms of policy making. So, for instance, in Florence, there was one of the citizens' panels. They were talking about media freedom, ownership of media outlets, etc. And I'm not an expert on that, but I was listening into the debate, and I just Googled it for a second and saw, oh, at that particular moment, the European Commission was proposing draft legislation on European media. They didn't address this even once. So the citizens who were sitting in that citizens panel in a way, depoliticized, de-empowered, and they weren't given the right information. So you might wonder if in those cases you don't create exactly a kind of perverse effect. How can you, as an individual citizen, do a type of job that a parliamentarian does, or with all kinds of help, where there's the political party you're part of that helps you out. You have your assistants that investigate stuff for you, etc. Instead, citizens need to do it all alone, and then hopefully get some kind of understanding in processes that last very little time. So that's a part of the story that's really problematic, I think. The second one is more important even. It didn't, and it doesn't most of the times, link up to what they would call in technical terms a maxi-parliament. So you have your 800 European citizens that talk about European issues. You have your roughly 400 million other European citizens that never talk about it, that never hear about it, that don't know anything about the whole process. So how democratic is that? I find that a huge problem, I have to say. Also because you lack then any kind of legitimatory process. If hardly anyone knows about it, it won't make the existing democratic system better. Could say a lot of things also about the deliberative process. I think in some cases, at least, there was a lot lacking there. The example I just gave was an example of where deliberation couldn't be of high quality because there wasn't sufficient input on the matter at hand. And the fourth issue is probably the most important one. That is the power issue. If you really want to reform democracy, you have to redistribute power. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. It remains as it was before. And I think in this case, it did remain as it was before. Citizens haven't really been steadily empowered through the process. And so that brings me to the final, and I think I have -5 minutes, so that's fantastic. The final question that I think we should always accompany any discussion on deliberative democracy, citizen assemblies with. That is, to what extent does it help? I think we need to cry for help now. Does it help save democracy? Is it something that in this particular historical context, where, as they say it in technical terms, the shit hits the fan, in what way do these assemblies help making democracy more robust, defend democracy? And so it's not only anymore about can we innovate in an incremental way or so democracy, it's about can we actually keep democracy alive? Because tomorrow we might wake up in an authoritarian system. And so in that sense, my view, as I said before, I think that too many people working on this stuff or working in this stuff forget to ask that question. So they're stuck in what I would call a one-dimensional democratic imagination, promoting citizens' assembly as a kind of panacea. This is going to revive our democracies, but forgetting that that's not necessarily true. It's also because of course, vested interest. If you have become a deliberative democracy entrepreneur, as I would want to call it, then you want this more and more. But maybe your critical distance is not necessarily as it should be. And so I think rather we should keep indeed democratic imagination open. For instance, an excellent book, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, is a recent book by André Pechtiger and John Dryzak, where they indeed discuss deliberative democracy in relation to populists, fascists, radical right. I'm not saying that they necessarily give us a full-blown way out of the mess we're in, but they do ask the right questions. That is, to what extent do deliberative assemblies and other forms of deliberative democracy help us to reduce the populist, radical right, anti-liberal, authoritarian trend? And this remains a really complex question, I think. And I believe, as I call it here, this is actually a wonderful his PhD thesis, I think, from Nicolas Guillot, who's currently, he was at the time at the UI when I was there, and he defended his thesis on this, and now he's back as a history professor. And he talked indeed about democracy makers studying what at the time still was the export of democracy, for instance, from the US to other parts of the world. I think with deliberative democracy, we see again a kind of community of democracy makers that too often stresses some kind of technocratic image of democratic experimentation, but is not necessarily interested in democracy as a form of civic empowerment. And I find that a problem. I find it problematic, I have to say. And so I think we should rather be very honest and transparent about things that go well, but also things that go wrong. And really ask ourselves seriously, what can these deliberative assemblies and mini-publics actually be good for? That's a tough question. So I would say I'm a bit in a pessimistic mood, but I've always been on one line with, I don't know if you know this French-Romanian author, Émile Cioran, who said about himself that he was a metaphysical pessimist. And I more or less in the same line, I think. And his first book, by the way, was on, it's called The Heights of Despair. What he wrote that because he couldn't sleep and he had suicidal tendencies. It's a real nice book to read. That's a bit my spirit this current time. And so the stakes, I think, are, first of all, can we return to a status quo ex ante? I don't think so. I think we should admit liberal democracy is failing us. And so we have to ask, what can we do to reinvent democracy? Is indeed deliberative assembly type of thinking the right way to go or not? I'm not sure. Or maybe specific ways, yes, others maybe not. And so if we don't ask those questions, maybe the whole thing collapses in civil war. The protest and the army interventions, the National Guard interventions in LA make me think that the US is trying to go into a civil war again, and democracy might even collapse. And I think you could also say this very clearly about the European Union. I mean, there are too many dimensions where the EU is not going into the right direction, to put it mildly. And I think a lot of it is, by the way, under the radar. Too many people are not aware of it. And so the question then remains, to what extent are deliberative assemblies part of comprehensive democratic response? Maybe they are, but maybe they need to discuss in a systemic way, linking them to other channels, which make them more palatable, more viable, etc. That's what some of the democratic theorists say when they talk about the kind of systems approach towards deliberative democracy. And so, yeah, maybe the final question is, and then maybe 5 seconds for a bit of self-promotion for Citizens Takeover Europe. 3 seconds. 3 seconds. The most critical question is probably, is deliberative democracy a status quo reproducing device, or is it able to be part of a radical imagination? I think we need the latter rather than the former, given that the status quo is not really working that well. Okay, I'll throw this away. Okay, a little bit of promotion. So within Citizens Takeover Europe, 5-6 years already, we promoted a blueprint on how to create an empowering European Citizens Assembly. And if you're interested in this, I just hint you to the website, which is this citizenstakeover.eu. And we also have within this coalition now a serve finance project where we actually organize citizens assemblies from the bottom up. So we had one with Marco Cappato in Brussels, early March, really interesting event. And I was in the weekend, I was in Paris, where European Alternatives, one of our partners, organized one with feminist organizations. And it was a really, really interesting attempt to use things like deliberation, but from the bottom up, as an instrument of alliance creation between civil society organizations, etc. I'll stop there. And I'm really sorry for going over time.
Brilliant. Let me stop. Thanks indeed, Paul. I think that's it was great that I forgot because I'm a mess. I forgot to introduce the broadly because I wanted to show. I mean, this great book, Imagining Europe, Transnational Contestation and Civil Populism, that Paul edited some years ago, and that was published by Palgrave. In this book, you can find some of the consideration you developed in this very fascinating talk. And we have almost 1 hour, well, 45 minutes for discussion. If you want to raise a question or if you want to share your comments, you can either intervene online and using the virtual end and take you the floor, or also, of course, I mean, if someone in the room wants to jump in, you're more than welcome. But the only thing is, if you want to ask a question, please come closer, otherwise the recording won't move. Okay? So any questions, comments? Also from our friends, I mean, we're online. Julia Gentile, then usually I will say that, but since you talk a lot,
Sorry.
people that, I mean, gather the questions, I mean, and then we will give you the last thing. Oh, that's nice. Please, Julia.
Thank you so much. Just to say that I think that Ishil was before me, so.
Sorry. Okay. Usually that first. Thanks, Julia.
You can continue.
Please, usual. Don't be shy.
Okay. Actually, for the presentation a lot. I really learned a lot, and I will benefit from. I know. What I would like to ask is, actually, I have 3 questions, but I will try to do 2, and then if I have time, if we will have time, maybe I can ask the other one. Actually, when we are talking about the creation of the publics, I inevitably think the country publics as well. So when we take the citizen participation as a kind of intrinsic value, we can miss some examples where participation can be used also as a weapon as much as the tool or strategy. So what I'm trying to say is that we say that there is no representation without participation, it is okay. But on the other hand, for the democracy that cannot even tolerate representative democracy, how can participation be the way out for the dilemmas of the representative democracy? And for example, I'm not only talking about the examples where citizens are involved, but there is no participation and empowerment, but even if there are citizens, but there is no, this is just an image of citizens, and they are just giving kind of they are just giving kind of appearance of democracy for the false regime through the participation. My first question was related to this. And the second question is, you were talking about the abortion and Irish case, and you gave the example of Ireland, but as you know, there is also another referendum last year in Ireland to change the 2 norms in the constitution that violate gender equality, definition of the family and also care, burden care. But people who seem to be progressive on more direct issues such as abortion said no in that referendum for 70% on a much more traditional issue. So if we are talking about the citizen assemblies, where do we put that kind of social contradictions as well? So I would like to ask this. And I have also another question, but I can maybe ask later in this because I don't want to occupy other time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Now it's your turn.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for the presentation. A lot of fruitful thoughts and a lot of dilemmas. And in fact, what I wanted to ask is probably that there is a reality of democracy that is intrinsically imperfect. The question is, of course, how we ensure that the imperfection of democracy is nonetheless functioning and functional to what we think are the most important values that we share as a society. So I think that we have examples of participatory democracy, we can say, in ancient Greece, even though, of course, women were excluded, there were slaves. But if we think, for instance, how justice was conducted, it was much more of a participatory endeavor. So because we have all these contradictory tensions, demands for more participation, but then when we participate, we cannot really achieve it, should we just perhaps have a much more, I would say, a much narrower understanding of democracy, where so long as we have the mechanisms to participate, or perhaps it's something else, not the participation. Maybe it's not the values, because I understand you don't think the values are an end in themselves. But should we perhaps think about democracy rather as a set of procedures that ensure participation or a form of governance in particular beyond the outcome, or would you rather embrace an outcome based view on democracy that does not really care about participation? Because so long as we have a system that protects certain values, whether it's a democracy or something else, we still have a core of democracy. I hope this makes sense, but otherwise I'm very happy to further develop this thought, this confused thought. Thank you.
Thanks indeed, Julia. So we have another 5 questions. So are you happy, or do you want to react? No, don't react immediately. So that's good.
I won't.
Okay with that?
Yeah, sure.
Good boy. Okay, so Nixon first. Come here. Otherwise, they won't hear you. Nixon.
So, Professor, thank you so much for your presentation. I enjoyed it. So, the first one is you mentioned something important in the sense that there is a missing aspect of an empowered citizen.
Of what?
An empowered citizen within the operation. And I think your arguments resonate very well with Stephen Viendy when he speaks about a civic republican. So my thinking or my question was looking at the stages you conceptualize in the sense of, there is initiation, there is deliberation, there is a follow-up. Is there room for kind of a civic education or capacity building to ensure that, this particular citizen has that kind of empowerment? That's one. Secondly, you mentioned that, within many publics, there is a push or there is, a move to kind of, tailor how this is supposed to work in a very specific way. So my concern with that, or a question on that, would be, is this general in the sense that participation for the people or by the people will be general in all processes within rulemaking, or is it does it also apply to the Constitution? Because at the point we are talking about the Constitution, then drawing from the theory of constituent power, it has to be free. It has to be allowed to have no limits. So at the point you specifically tie constitution making to this specific, you can change the rule kind of publics. Is it that, kind of going contrary to that? And the last one is, you mentioned that referendums are looked at in terms of, direct forms of participation. And this is my dilemma again. There are also arguments that referendums are also indirect forms of representation, in the sense that at the point they're intervening in between a continuous kind of constitution making, or the constitution is ongoing, or with no break of legality. When a referendum comes in, that is where they are saying, no, this is representative. At the point it is at the beginning or at constitution making at the initial or ground zero, where they are saying that is direct. So I don't know where that place is. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Professor. I also really enjoyed the presentation. Okay, so two questions, one easy and one a bit more intriguing. So the easy one is that you said that you follow, you monitor sort of citizen assemblies, right? So it's just out of curiosity, what are the main topics that are being discussed in these assemblies and how are they composed? So what is the actual social composition? So in terms of age, gender, but also like migration backgrounds, because that is also an intriguing question. How do you involve non-nationals residing in another country? Not necessarily EU citizens, for example. And this is the easiest question. So it's the easier question, and the more difficult one regards this an issue at which you hinted at the end of your presentation regarding the risk of populism. And if I think of democratic participation, also to ask the voice, to represent the voice of the people, to ask the opinion of the people, and I can assure you that no other EU member state makes more claims to represent the will of the people than Hungary. So there are these national consultations that are always, 90% of people voted in this and that other way. The last one was in March, in April this year on Ukraine's EU membership. Just asking Hungarian citizens whether they would be satisfied with that. And of course, whether Hungary is a democratic country or not is out of question. So how would you address this issue of this risk, this threat that citizens' participation gets instrumentalized? Also in terms of Giuseppe and Giacomo wrote a wonderful book on populism and the politics of immediacy. So how would you address this threat? This is a good question, I guess.
Thank you, Camilla. So now, do you want to have the first round reaction and then?
Yeah, maybe it's.
We have so many questions from the audience.
Yeah, maybe it's better because. Yeah, I try to be short because otherwise I forget that my age.
The age, I mean, is.
I hardly know where I am anymore. So. No, let me. I try to be brief, although these were all very, very excellent remarks and questions. The first on publics and counter-publics. I tend to think that indeed there's a great risk of using these things. Maybe this also ties into some of the other questions towards what they call now citizen washing. Indeed, using consultation forms, etc., to claim them as a commission is one of the best, but of course Orban knows how to do this too, where you can then claim, well, the citizens have spoken, but whether this is really the case is a very different story. And I think there is a problem within the deliberative assembly type of exercises that too often, as some of my fellow scholars like Alvaro Olia also have argued, it becomes kind of depoliticized deliberation. So you take one topic and basically you claim that if you deliberate with the right type of input, you get the best answer, and there you are. There are hardly any of these deliberative assemblies that really touch upon really tough questions. I mean, of course, there's the one that was only one of the questions, by the way, of the Irish Convention on Abortion. Then, for instance, recently in France, at the Assembly on Euthanasia. These are questions, I think, that are much more useful for citizens' assemblies, because then it's not simply consultation. You have a topic like abortion for which there is no final solution, as far as I can see. There's always possibility of differing in ethical positions, etc. And so there, it's difficult to be purely technocratic. There are different sides that need to become part of the story. So coming back to the question then, I think if you said, for instance, publics and counter-publics, my understanding, having looked also at assemblies in practice, is they could be actually super useful in trying to link different publics, try to find affinities, overlaps, etc. But I think most of the times you don't really see that because of this religion of sortition and sort of blind algorithmic selection of the participants. The thing on abortion in Ireland, I think I mentioned that referendum, by the way. I fully agree, although the story is more complex, of course, because the progressive people voted against because they thought that the proposal for changing the constitution was much too weak, was not progressive enough. So it's a bit more a difficult story, I think. To Julia, imperfection of democracy, of course, I couldn't agree more. Of course, the trick is how do we manage to replace serious imperfections that are now blowing up democracies by other imperfections that make things still ongoing. And I think that is a core thing that indeed democratic experimentation should look at. On EU values, by the way, I don't want to say that they're not an end in themselves. I find it problematic to think that if you invoke them, you have resolved the story. And I know this particularly from people studying jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice, that think that if all citizens would have decent knowledge of EU Court of Justice case law, then we would be in a perfect democratic utopian society. I don't think that's true. I don't think human rights can be reduced to jurisprudence of the European Court, for instance. I find that very problematic. So indeed, I think EU values are super important, but that's why we should discuss them in public and show how multiversal they are in reality. You can just say democracy. Democracy means everything and nothing. The outcome-based view of democracy, I wouldn't stress. I have to say, I do agree that the socioeconomic question, inequality, is a major issue. But I still think if we talk about democratic experimentation, it can be purely based on what is the most performative, productive democracy. It's about deep democratic questions, I think, that go much beyond that. The remark on the missing part on civic education is spot on. I think that's an important question. I have to think about that. Although I do think, from the top of my head, so to speak, that most citizens' assemblies are not doing enough, though. I mean, what good does it do if you educate 800 citizens in Europe? And some of them became very enthusiastic. You know, some of the citizens of the Conference on the Future of Europe went into civil society. Some even think of political careers. That's interesting, but it's a bit like, I'm working a lot on this, by the way, in relation to the Erasmus study abroad program. Also there, it's ultimately too few. I mean, our societies are collapsing in terms of democratic issues. And so indeed, the core question is, how do you enlarge civic education as much as you can? On constituent power, I think we could have a whole week of discussions. My easy way out is simply saying, well, I've always appreciated the work of Andrew Arato, and I've always bought into his theory of a multi-stage constituent process, where there are different moments in which constituent power is flamed and feeds into the process. That the actual examples he studied, South Africa and Hungary, in reality proved 10 times more problematic. He would be fully agreeing. I met him recently in a conference in Budapest for his 80 years of age, celebrating his work, etc. He's now studying the cyclicality, the cyclical nature of politics. And so basically say, well, democracy is now over. Let's prepare for the authoritarian moment. And on referendum, I'm not entirely sure if I fully grasp your remark. But maybe we can talk about that later, is that okay? And then the final on the easy and the difficult. Well, the easy already briefly, I think I mentioned some. I think most of the times the problem with topics of citizens' assemblies is that they are too technocratic. They're too much about the kind of something that needs a solution in practice. Maybe on a local level that could actually be a powerful tool. But I think what is too often missing is using assemblies as community building discussions, as they did in Iceland, by the way, which in that sense is a good example, to discuss how do we want to get out of the mess. So the first National Assembly in Iceland was on what values do we want our Constitution to articulate. And you might say, well, that's all very vague stuff. But in reality, all of our societies are hyper-polarized, fragmented. So maybe you could think of assemblies as being more tools of discussing together why are we actually in the same society, etc. On the social background stuff, indeed, there's a whole literature on this. Most of the times, don't have your huge variety. Like if you look at the Conference on the Future of Europe, it's a bit strange that you have maybe out of 800 citizens, 5, 6 people with a slightly different skin color. How the hell is that possible in a European context? Which, of course, there are all kinds of minorities of different kinds, but it's just very difficult also practically to try to get those people on board. And there are also other more less happy stories about the recruiters maybe not doing their job. And that's a slightly different story. The difficult one, maybe it's not so difficult. I mean, in the sense that I just don't think that, for instance, Orban can make any claims on really representing the voice of the people, because if you claim that democracy is based on the voice of the people, you always have to admit that it should be a plurality position. And all those national consultations, they filter out any kind of diverse position, like Partecipa did with the Italian constitution reform, by the way. You got like, well, there was no option to say, well, this is actually completely the wrong way to go or so. So, I mean, these are false, and I think with Orban, as with Trump and with J.D. Vance, etc., I'm trying to slowly get my head around conceptualizing the notion of what I call democratic gaslighting. That's what I think they do. They use the term democracy. In reality, it has nothing to do with democracy. And so, in that sense, indeed, and that's my final sentence, those populist conservative right-wingers, they don't like assembly's law, because their people would be able to talk, right? They would be able to share here, and the national consultation is not the same, right? It's passive, individual, kind of survey type of stuff. It's not really public deliberation on complex issues.
Are you ready for the second round?
Always present.
Okay, so
Then I drop this.
Lorenzo, Rachele, and again you. If you survive.
It's unlikely.
Well, thanks for thanks for this presentation. It was very thoughtful. A couple of remarks on my side, just to check if we have a bias or maybe there is evidence for thinking in any other way. I got the impression that, repeat, I'm afraid this may be a personal bias. These exercises in participatory democracy may become a sort of window dressing by the institutions, which made them say, well, I hit the box, citizens have participated, we're democratic, and then once the job is done, public policies take a completely different course of action. I wonder if there is any evidence that proves me wrong. We do the exercise, citizens are involved, then the policy output is more in line with what citizens want, because indeed, the consultation is truly representative, because the consultation has reached out to many different constituencies, and so on and so forth. So that's the first thing. The second one is even more cynical. Isn't this kind of consultation many different forms, from assemblies to town hall meetings, etc., a bit hypocritical? In other words, we do this kind of light forms of consultation, and then we kill big ideas where European democracy can be transformed. So we kill, for instance, the idea of having a transnational constituency in EP elections, and then we will do the consultation here and there to claim we are democratic. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. And I have a question that probably moves from a remark that is related to the statement that citizen assemblies are good per se. Probably these are a sort of answer to for people in participating, and so making people responsible of the public area. But what is the relation between the so-called right to be let alone from Zygmunt Bauman thinking? Because from my point of view, this is a characteristic of the Western democracy, and then it is a characteristic that is creating a sort of clash between different ideas of rights, and so citizen assembly probably can be seen in Europe as a sort of solution for filling the gaps, the institutional gaps of the European Union. If you consider polls, we are voting for people that then is raising a sort of commandant with other people, and then expressing a commission and in practical the power that is managing Europe. And so there is a sort of distance between people and what is the managing of European Union. Thank you very much.
Yes.
So thank you for your presentation. It's a fascinating vantage point for a constitutional scholar. My first question is, in your opinion, what is the role of expertise in the broadest sense vis-a-vis these assemblies? I'm thinking of an example from France, the two city conventions on climate first and right to die second. In the latter case, the governance committee decided not to establish an internal drafting committee, as the task of the assembly is not, I'm quoting, to draft legislative proposals. So the idea is you discuss, you may make proposals, but these proposals will not be immediately converted into legislative proposals. And I also have a remark, since what I find fascinating in your presentation is that you refer to a complex notion of constitution, constitutional change, constitutional politics, and for legal scholars this is quite crucial, as we tend to focus pretty much on entrenched procedures, which, as the Italian case, not only the Italian case shows, hardly fit all forms of attempted change. So you have pointed to a diverse landscape with carefully tailored ad hoc solutions, which may also entail some ambiguity, as shown by the Convention on the Future of Europe. So the Convention was supposed to make proposals on a very wide array of topics, but the link between these proposals and treaty change was, let's say, a bit ambiguous, to say the least. But this is also closely related with civic education. This is quite important also for legal scholars when they, let's say, look beyond the nitty-gritty of amending procedures. Thank you.
I told you, I mean, we was actually gave us a lot of food for it's the price of your success. No, correct.
Thank you, Professor. My question is about the relationship between these forms of civic participation and abstention. Abstention, even especially in Italy, has become a real problem for correct development of democratic dynamics. And so, for sure, involving citizens to a higher degree in the deliberatory and democratic process is surely a positive factor. But at the same time, I'm asking myself, would it become a boost for participation at the elections, or instead it would replace participation to elections with this participation to forums, to all these kind of alternative forms of participation, due to the fact that it's more direct form of intervention, and without an immediate form of intervention, without the presence of a representative. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. And now Raquel, who is also postdoc working in this project, in this Horizon 2020 project. Raquel, ready with you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Professor, for your presentation. Actually, I found it very interesting, the idea of imagining and reimagining new forms of democracy. And my question is actually a bit linked with the one of a colleague speaking about the risk of instrumentalization of these groups. So my question is, are actually these assemblies part of the solution to the democratic crisis, or are they part of the problem in a way? So do they really facilitate the development of the political process, or do they instead promote the fragmentation of the public discourse and in a way the dispersion of common issues into separate interests, which are in a way aligned with a person's affiliation to a specific group? I hope that my question was well understood.
Thank you, Rachele. Usual, for your third question.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry if I'm occupying too much time, but I would like to ask about, because we were mentioning also, for example, asking right to asylum for citizens, but I was thinking, isn't it directly unfair to ask citizens, for example, about the right to asylum, given the political forces that directly determine who is a citizen? Or how do we ensure that the fundamental rights are not subject to the referendum? For example, when we are thinking about putting abortion to a referendum, it means also that prior acceptance that women's rights may be less in some conservative societies. For example, you cannot put a referendum question for the abortion right in some societies. It means that if that right is legally recognizable, it's legally possible, you would risk that kind of rights, and you will accept that kind of less rights in conservative societies for some certain groups. So I would like to ask about that. How do we ensure that we cannot deliberate or put a referendum for the fundamental rights?
Thank you, usual. I would also have other 200 questions, but I think it is now time to give the last say to our guest. Please, Paul.
I don't know where to start, actually. I can't even find the start. Let me see. Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, so the first remark on the sort of the window dressing. One thing that occurred to me is also that what I've always found very problematic, and it's part of this citizen washing, is this peculiar way of looking at democracy. You have politicians, you have civil society, and then you have citizens, and the citizens become the citizen. So it's a bit it's the same, I've written about this once on a blog piece. It's a kind of the notion of the average or ordinary citizen that becomes a proxy for the whole democratic society, which I find very, very problematic. And then, yeah, you could say more about that, how that is extremely problematic if citizens' assemblies are supposed to give voice to what is in reality a pluralistic society. And there also, you could ask questions there about how useful deliberative assemblies are then, if in most cases they lead to some kind of common outcome, right? So like what they did in Fiesole, for instance, at the European Citizens Panel number 2, it was in the end hands up. And that meant that a couple of recommendations didn't make it. And so then the plurality of different voices becomes once again, the average citizen speaks, whatever that means. And I found it also interesting remark on the hypocritical nature, indeed. And yeah, it makes me think, yeah, it would be interesting to investigate this further. So then becomes, in a way, you use consultation and citizens' assemblies as to draw attention away from more dramatic, more radical forms of reform, right? Like transnational lists, for instance. But then again, I have to admit, there wasn't necessarily that much room for it. But if you look at the Conference on the Future Europe, the recommendations say, let's get rid of unanimity. Let's have a European referendum. Let's have a permanent assembly. Let's have these transnational lists. They just don't really follow up on that because it doesn't feed into directly in a majority in the European Parliament. Today's are even less than in the older Parliament before 2024. What else did we have there? Okay, citizens' assemblies as good per se. I like the remark on the right to be left alone. And in a way, a kind of, I guess the argument there seems to be a kind of totalitarian participatory. And yeah, I tend to sympathize with that. Maybe that's a problem, exactly. I wonder, and there is a bit of debate on this, also the book by Urbinati and Lafont on that big critique on sortition ends with a chapter 9 or so, where then in reality they say, well, maybe assemblies should not be seen as an institutional device. They should increasingly become a kind of part of public sphere, in a way of reviving the public sphere. And that, I think, is already a much more interesting dimension, where participation should be open. It shouldn't be that you necessarily lose out if you don't participate, but if you find a topic that you think is very important to you, you step in. You won't wonder, of course, what that then would mean, because if it doesn't really have any political bite follow-up, it remains perhaps less powerful. Giacomo, on the role of expertise, well, that's a really important question, I think. And there is a bit of a discussion on that, also very nitty-gritty on the technocratic part, right? How and when should expert be in there? Like the big mister in the conference on the future of Europe was that they asked people like me, and they didn't ask somebody with a completely different vision. And so there wasn't pro and contra. So there wasn't, and there was also some expertise just dramatically missing. So I do think you should have had there, for instance, if citizens debate European democracy, there should be one that wants radical democracy, I don't know, a binding European citizens initiative or so, and the other should be, I don't know, a European conservative right-winger or so, wants, I don't know, wants to reduce democracy or something. If not, what kind of debate do you really stimulate? But these are important questions. I think the distinction you made between the climate and euthanasia assemblies also points indeed to different objectives, right? I tend to be in certain ways more interested in the euthanasia one, which it was also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, more participatory, also behind the scenes, which is interesting in its own right. But it remains a tough question, and I think it's a larger question about any democratic process in terms of which actors are involved and how. And so, for instance, one experiment I didn't mention was coordinated partially by the European University Institute, the Democratic Odyssey. And there I participated as one of the facilitators in Athens. And there they had actually not only citizens, but also civil society representatives. And in some cases, I think that really backfired, because you could say it's actually good that you have different voices around the table that give also more expertise on specific topics. But in my case, at least, they managed also to hijack the discussion and then push it away from what the original discussion actually was. Because as a civil society professional, you know how to do that, you know how to make your point, you know how to depoliticize, disempowered citizen doesn't have the capacity most of the time. So they're really important questions. What you said about constitutional change, I find really interesting. I think one of the most interesting questions is, I'm not sure if there's much of a literature on that, is how, for instance, deliberative and participatory instruments, they often tend to be outside, indeed, of the institutional rules, for instance, the amendment rules. Like partecipa is not something we see in, Article 138 of the Italian Constitution. And so it's also, in a way, often a bit outside of the formal process. And it would be interesting, I think, to investigate, well, what does it actually mean? In which cases, like in the Irish, it, in a way, it changes what constitutional reform also in the formal way actually means. And that is, I think, an interesting part of the story. On the treaty change dimension, I think that with the Conference on the Future of Europe, there are at least two dimensions, right? There's politicians, including von der Leyen, actually stating the openness to treaty change. That's one thing. And the second thing is whether the actual recommendations would necessitate treaty change. And I think on that second argument, a lot of nonsense has been said. A lot of claims have been made also by lawyers and experts saying, well, there's actually no treaty change necessary for this stuff. Because if you, for instance, read a permanent European Citizens Assembly as some kind of ad hoc, semi-institutionalized vehicle with no power, yeah, then you don't need treaty change. But if you read it in a radical way, you probably would need treaty change because it changes the balances of power. And so I think a lot could be, more could be said about that. The question about Lorenzo and abstention, that's a really, really good one, I think, and a really tough one, I have to say. I guess most of us would argue abstention is a problem, right? So I guess the way I see it at the moment is the most useful dimension of assemblies could be more bottom-up in a way, allowing people to speak out in more or less public fora. But then I think you would need to craft assemblies, and I've also said that in our City Then project, that directly address populism. May I use a very technical philosophical term, bullshit. And so it shouldn't be technocratic assemblies, but it should be directly talking about, I don't know, the right to asylum, for instance. Not necessarily with policy-making repercussions, but highlighting the different parts of the story. Highlighting the facts and non-facts, the bullshit on what migration is nowadays, how it works, is it really growing or not, are all migrants criminals, that kind of stuff. And I don't think that most institutions have the heart and stomach to organize an assembly like that, because that's of course super difficult at this moment. But that's exactly the type of topics I think you would need people to talk about. Then it should become more engaging, I suppose. Let me see. There was a remark on instrumentalization that I found very good. And if I understood it correctly, also in a way saying that often, at least that's the way I read it, citizens' assemblies bring in certain people, but those certain people can often be classified as the usual suspects. So also there, the Conference on the Future of Europe was a bit odd that if you look at European societies, all societies in Europe have very sizable groups that promote populist ideas or endorse populist ideas. But in the Conference on the Future of Europe, I know one German lady that admitted that she had voted for the AfD, but that was 1 out of 800 or so. And so it didn't reflect the complexity of European society in terms of political positions. And so there I wonder if that is not a problem indeed in the whole, the way these assemblies are set up, the way sortition is supposedly neutral and technocratic, but in reality it doesn't really work. It's not managing to put the more difficult groups into the mix of deliberation. The final one I like really much about the referenda and different types of societies. Yeah, that's, you're right. I mean, it's in a way a bit, in a way, the nutshell is that the core of the question is always, you can't control referenda, right? Or you try, but you never really be sure what the outcome is. And so in different societies that may play out in different ways. That's also why I think referenda could be more positive means of change if they're tied to other processes. In that sense, the Irish case, I think, is not that bad, because there was a citizens' assembly where a larger part spoke out in favor of liberalizing abortion, right? And then again, in the second step, you put it to a referendum, so you get the whole demos potentially being able to speak out. That doesn't, of course, mean that you can dictate for any specific society what kind of position they should have on abortion. But then again, it strikes me that in many of the conservative societies, as you called it, let's take a random case, Poland, a large majority is in favor of a more accessible right to abortion and not the opposite. And so, but I'm not sure how assemblies relate to the Polish question. Maybe they should have one on abortion in that country. I don't know. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Well, thanks indeed. the professor.
Oh, the tiger. What a tiger.
Was indeed. I mean, it was like Swiss. Oh, well, we still have 4 minutes.
Skip, you have jokes?
I mean, for jokes.
I'm good at jokes.
All right. So, well, thanks indeed. And so much a bit of editing, so I'll send David the detail for the final approval before uploading to our YouTube channel.
Okay.
Right, so
As long as you make sure that you can't find it Googling. So.
of course, I'll do my best as always. All my notes depend on how to see. All right. So thanks so much, and keep in touch. See you. Ciao.
Thanks, ciao.
Stop.